The Tesco on Kirkgate opened at 6. By 6:43, the man in cubicle 3 of the ground floor bathroom had not moved in 11 minutes. A cleaner noticed the shoes first. White Air Force Ones, one lace undone, perfectly still in the gap beneath the door. She knocked twice. Nothing. She knocked again, harder this time, and called out. The shoes did not shift. She went to get her manager, and her manager called 999, and by the time the call connected, the man inside had been on the floor for 14 minutes. His name was Ryan Callow. He was 29 years old. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. When the paramedics got the cubicle door open, here is what they found. A young man on his side, breathing, slow, too slow, one breath every 8 seconds, with pupils the size of pinpoints and a pulse that was present but thin. His jacket was unzipped. His right hand was open, palm facing the ceiling, fingers loosely curled around a small piece of paper. A receipt. Thermal paper, the kind that fades fast. 3 pharmacy names printed in faint grey ink. 3 timestamps across a single morning. 3 separate transactions. It was a Tuesday. Ryan didn't look like the person most people picture when they hear the word addict. That word carries a specific image. Most people know the one. Ryan was not that image. He had a job. He had a direct debit for a gym he hadn't visited in 7 months, which meant he had once cared enough about his health to set up a direct debit. He had a girlfriend named Stacy, who worked in NHS administration, and who, at the precise moment Ryan was on the floor of a Tesco bathroom, was 40 minutes into a morning shift and had not yet checked her phone. The paramedic administered naloxone. Within 90 seconds, Ryan's breathing changed. Here is what dihydrocodeine is, because most people who are about to encounter this story have never heard of it. It is not heroin. It is not fentanyl. It does not have a street name that sounds dangerous, or a reputation that precedes it in the way that harder drugs do. Dihydrocodeine, DHC in medical shorthand, is a prescription painkiller that has been used in British medicine since the 1940s. It is related to codeine, the mild opioid found in certain over-the-counter cough medicines but roughly twice as strong. It is prescribed legally and commonly by NHSGPS for moderate to severe pain. It comes in a white box. It has a patient information leaflet. It is, by every surface appearance, medicine. In 2026, it has become something else. By the spring of this year, harm reduction charities operating in Leeds, Manchester, Sheffield, and Birmingham had begun to document something that did not yet have a name in any government report. Their drop-in centres, the places where people struggling with addiction come for clean needles, naloxone kits, and someone who won't call the police, were recording a shift. Not in heroin, not in crack, in something that arrived in a white box with a patient information leaflet. DHC presentations at these centres had tripled in 18 months. In some sites, quadrupled. The people coming through the doors did not look like the image either. Ryan Callow was not the first. He was not the worst case. He was not even, in the clinical sense, an extreme one. He was one data point in a pattern that had been building quietly for 3 years while the NHS prescription system continued to function exactly as designed. While GP waiting lists grew longer, while locum doctors rotated through surgeries they had never visited before and would not visit again, while a harm reduction worker in Leeds named Donna Fielding filed reports that sat unread in digital queues over long weekends. The ambulance left Kirkgate at 6:59 a.m. Ryan's phone, screen cracked at one corner, was in his jacket pocket. The paramedic noted it during the patient assessment. It was not relevant to treatment. What was relevant to treatment was the naloxone dosage, the SpO2 reading, the blood pressure, the question of whether Ryan had taken anything other than an opioid. The phone had 11 missed calls, all from the same number. The calls had come in over the previous 4 days, 3 or 4 per day, the most recent at 11:17 p.m. the night before. The name attached to that number was saved simply as Mum. Nobody on the ambulance looked at the phone long enough to see that. There are questions that don't get answered on the way to the hospital. Why those 3 pharmacies? What was on the receipt line by line? Why a 29-year-old man with a shift supervisor role at a warehouse and a girlfriend and a gym membership he kept meaning to cancel was on the floor of a supermarket bathroom at the hour when most people are still deciding whether to hit snooze a second time? And one more question, the one that would take the rest of the story to answer properly. His mother had called 11 times in 4 days. 4 days. She had not stopped calling. Something had made her keep dialing the same number, again and again, each time the call went unanswered. What did she know that Ryan didn't? His hand relaxed on the ambulance stretcher. The receipt slipped from his fingers, caught a current of air from the open rear doors, and settled face down on the floor. The timestamps were face down. The pharmacy names were face down. Whatever the receipt knew, it was keeping to itself for now. The doors closed. The ambulance moved. October 2023 was the month Ryan Callow's back gave out, and it happened in the most unremarkable way possible. A wet loading dock. A half turn at the wrong angle while shifting a 40-kilogram pallet. A sensation like something being pressed against a nerve ending that had no business being pressed against. He straightened up, finished the shift. 4 more hours, because the replacement hadn't arrived and Ryan was not the kind of person who left early, and drove home at 5 a.m. with his left hand doing most of the steering because his right arm had started sending electric pulses down to his elbow every time he gripped something. He was 27 at the time. He had never had a serious injury before. The warehouse was a logistics hub on the southern edge of Morley, just outside Leeds. A flat-roofed building the size of 3 football pitches that processed returns for 2 major online retailers. Ryan had worked there for 4 years, the last 18 months as a night shift supervisor. That meant he was responsible for 23 people across a 10-hour window, from 9 in the evening until 7 in the morning, in a building where the floor was concrete, the heating was inadequate, and every winter someone pulled something they shouldn't have pulled. He booked a GP appointment the following morning. The next available slot was 9 days away. He went to work for those 9 days. By the time he sat in the GP's office, the nerve pain had settled into something more consistent. A dull, grinding pressure in his lower back that sharpened whenever he sat for more than 20 minutes or lifted anything above knee height. The GP was a locum, which meant she was covering for the surgery's regular doctor who was on leave. She had Ryan's notes on screen but had not read them before he walked in. The appointment lasted 8 minutes. She pressed 2 fingers against the base of Ryan's spine, asked him to rate his pain on a scale of 1 to 10, and noted his answer of 6. She mentioned physiotherapy. There was a 16-week wait. She mentioned over-the-counter ibuprofen. Then she mentioned dihydrocodeine. She said it was for short-term use. She printed the prescription. Ryan had never heard of dihydrocodeine before that appointment. Most people haven't. It sits in the middle of the opioid ladder, a pharmacological ranking system doctors use to match pain levels to medication strength. At the bottom, paracetamol, ibuprofen. In the middle, codeine, dihydrocodeine, tramadol. At the top, morphine, oxycodone, fentanyl. DHC occupies the kind of position on that ladder where it feels safe, because it is not the top, but where it is far more powerful than most patients realize, because it is nowhere near the bottom. The box contained 60 tablets, 30 milligrams each. The patient information leaflet was 4 pages long, folded to credit card size and printed in 8-point font. Side effects listed included nausea, dizziness, constipation, and, on page 4, in the same font size as everything else without emphasis, dependence with prolonged use. Ryan did not read page 4. He took his first tablet at 11 p.m, sitting on the edge of the bed before his Thursday night shift. Stacey was already asleep. The flat in Hare Hills was quiet. The radiator clicked. A car alarm sounded briefly 2 streets over, then nothing. He swallowed the tablet with a glass of water and sat there for a moment in the dark before getting up to find his jacket. Stacey Okafor had been with Ryan for 3 years by that point. She worked as an admin coordinator at a GP surgery in Chapel Allerton, the same NHS system that had just given Ryan his prescription in a different building 6 miles north. She was 27, meticulous in the way that people who manage appointment systems and patient records tend to become, and she had a habit of leaving a light on in the kitchen when Ryan left for nights, so he'd have something other than darkness to come home to. The kitchen light was on when Ryan got back at 7:15 a.m. on Friday morning. His back pain was gone, not reduced, not manageable. Gone, the way a sound disappears when someone finally turns off the television in the next room and you hadn't realised how constant it was until the silence arrived. He stood in the kitchen under the fluorescent light and rolled his shoulders, bent slightly at the waist, pressed his own thumb into the base of his spine. Nothing. He made toast. He ate it standing up, which he hadn't been able to do comfortably in 3 weeks. This is not a small thing, to be without pain after weeks of it. The brain registers the absence of suffering as something close to euphoria, even without chemical assistance. With DHC, the line between those two things, relief and euphoria, is pharmacologically thin. The drug binds to opioid receptors, the same receptors that respond to the body's own natural painkillers, but with a force the body cannot produce on its own. It does not simply reduce pain, it introduces, at therapeutic doses, a mild warmth, a settling, a sense that the world's volume has been turned down to a manageable level. Ryan went to sleep at 8 a.m. and did not move until 3 in the afternoon. For the next 3 weeks, the pattern held. Tablet before shift, back pain absent, work manageable. Ryan told Stacey the prescription was working, which was true in the way that the most important facts often are, completely accurate and only part of the picture. He was not high. That matters, and it is worth understanding clearly. At 30 milligrams once or twice daily, dihydrocodeine in a person without prior opioid exposure produces analgesia, pain relief, and a mild background warmth that many users describe as simply feeling better, not euphoric, not impaired in any noticeable way, functional. The kind of better that makes a person go to work and make toast and sleep properly and think, this is what not being in pain feels like. That thought is the beginning of something, not the crisis, that comes later. The thought itself is not the problem. The problem is what the thought builds toward, slowly, in the background, in the same way that a structural issue in a building is not visible in the wall until long after it began. Ryan's prescription ran out on a Saturday in November. His back pain returned by Sunday evening, not catastrophically. A familiar ache, a tightness, nothing he hadn't lived with for weeks. He noted it. He went to the GP website that night and requested a repeat prescription. The request was processed on Monday. He collected the new box on Tuesday. The second locum who issued the repeat had never seen Ryan before. He would not see Ryan again. The second prescription lasted 11 days instead of 30. Ryan noticed this only after the box was empty. He counted backwards, how many per day, which days he'd taken more, and the numbers didn't quite resolve into an explanation that felt significant. Some nights had been harder. Some shifts had required more from him physically. The loading bay was cold in December, colder than usual, and cold made the back worse. He had reasons. They were real reasons. He went back to the GP surgery on a Wednesday morning, 4 days earlier than the prescription schedule suggested he should need to. The appointment was with a different locum, the third different doctor he'd seen at this practice in 8 weeks. The surgery had 4 GPs listed on its website. Ryan had met none of them. This locum was covering 3 surgeries simultaneously across a 12-mile radius, which was not unusual. In some parts of England in 2025, locum coverage accounted for more than a third of all GP appointments, filling gaps left by a workforce that had been shrinking relative to demand for a decade. The appointment lasted 7 minutes this time. The new prescription was for 60 tablets. Here is what tolerance means, because the word gets used loosely and the reality is more precise. Tolerance is not psychological. It is not a matter of willpower or weakness. It is a physical process. The body's opioid receptors, repeatedly flooded with an external chemical, begin to recalibrate. They reduce their own sensitivity. They require more signal to produce the same response. This happens in the liver, in the brain stem, in receptor sites that have no awareness of what is happening to them. It happens whether the person taking the drug is paying attention or not. It is not a choice. It is biology. By February 2024, 3 months after his first prescription, Ryan's back pain had objectively improved. The physiotherapy referral had come through faster than expected, 6 weeks instead of 16, and 2 sessions in. The physiotherapist noted that the trapped nerve was responding well. She suggested he could begin reducing the DHC. Ryan did not mention this to his next GP. The reason he gave himself at the time was that the back still ached on the worst nights. Concrete floors, 12-hour shifts. He was not wrong. The ache was real. But it was a 3 out of 10 some nights, not the 6 that had warranted the prescription in the first place. What was also real, and harder to name, the hour before a shift when he had not yet taken a tablet felt different now. Not painful exactly. An unease, a low-grade restlessness that gathered in his chest and the backs of his knees and made concentration difficult. He knew from the pattern of it that it disappeared within 40 minutes of taking DHC. He had not yet connected that knowledge to anything alarming. 60 miles south, in a GP surgery in Rotherham, a doctor named Priya Mehta was working through her Tuesday list when the 3rd patient that month requested an early DHC refill. Dr. Mehta had been a GP for 12 years. She knew the rhythm of a chronic pain patient's prescription cycle, the way a musician knows a time signature. You felt when something was slightly off before you could articulate why. The first early refill request that month had come with a story about tablets lost on holiday. The second, a bathroom cabinet emptied during a house move. The 3rd patient that Tuesday told her the tablets had been accidentally thrown away with a newspaper. 3 patients, 3 different explanations, all within the same 4-week window, all DHC. She issued the refill. She had no clinical grounds to refuse, but she noted the pattern in her own records, in a comment field that would not automatically reach any other system. NHS prescribing data existed in silos. A GP in Rotherham had no automatic visibility of what a GP in Sheffield or Leeds was prescribing to whom. The electronic prescription service processed millions of scripts per month and flagged for certain controlled drugs under Schedule 2 and 3 of the Misuse of Drugs Act. Dihydrocodeine was Schedule 5. Different rules, different scrutiny. Dr. Mehta made her note and moved on to her next patient. Ryan, meanwhile, took his first tablet of the day at midnight on a Thursday. Not before a shift, but before trying to sleep after one. He had finished at 11, driven home, eaten something standing over the kitchen sink. His back was a 2 out of 10. He took the tablet anyway. Not for the back. He would not have been able to say exactly what it was for if asked directly. The question had not been asked. Stacy was asleep. The kitchen light was on, as always. He stood there for a moment in the quiet of the flat, and when the DHC reached him 20 minutes later, that familiar settling, the world's volume dropping half a notch, he understood, without forming it as a thought, that this was the part of the day he had been moving towards since he woke up. That was month 3. By month 4, he had begun tracking pharmacy opening hours, not obsessively. A note on his phone: which pharmacies near the warehouse open before 8 a.m, which ones had a walk-in prescription counter versus an automated kiosk. He told himself this was practical. He worked nights. Pharmacy hours were genuinely awkward for him. Both of these things were true. He was also by this point taking an extra tablet some nights. One extra. 30 milligrams above his prescribed dose. Not every shift. Maybe 3 times a week. He did not tell Stacy. He did not tell his GP. He had not told anyone, because it had not yet occurred to him that it was information requiring disclosure. The one extra tablet had a specific effect he had not experienced at the prescribed dose. It was subtle. Not intoxication, nothing that dramatic. A warmth that lasted longer. A quality of stillness in the early hours of a shift when the warehouse was quiet and the pallets were moving, and everything was operating as it should. He felt during those hours like a sharper version of himself, more focused, less irritated by small frictions. He was 28 years old and he felt 22. He noted the feeling. He wanted it again the following shift. Then there was the question Dr. Mehta had begun sitting with, in the spare minutes between appointments she rarely had. One of her 3 patients, the one with the newspaper story, had requested another early refill 3 weeks later. She cross-referenced his appointments. 6 refill requests in 4 months, each arriving 7 to 10 days before the prescription should have run out. She pulled his notes fully for the first time and saw something she had not thought to look for before. He was not taking DHC for chronic pain. He was taking it for anxiety. Prescribed originally 2 years ago by a different GP in the practice, DHC had been issued alongside an antidepressant as short-term pain relief for a dental procedure. The antidepressant had been discontinued. The DHC had not. She stared at the screen for a moment. Then she looked at her next patient's notes, because she had 14 people to see before lunch. But she did not close the tab, and 3 weeks later, when a 4th patient in her list requested an early DHC refill, a woman in her 40s, back pain, credible history, a reason that sounded nothing like the other 3, Dr. Mehta issued the prescription, closed the appointment, and typed a message to her practice manager flagging the pattern. The practice manager responded 2 days later. The response was thoughtful and went nowhere. Ryan did not know any of this. He could not have known. He was in Leeds, not Rotherham. He had never met Dr. Mehta. He was not her patient, but the pharmacist at the Boots on Roundhay Road had begun to recognise his face. She had not said anything yet. There was no protocol that required her to. Ryan's prescriptions were valid, his NHS number was consistent, and he was polite in the way that people who are managing something carefully tend to be: quiet, quick, not lingering. She had seen this before, working at the same pharmacy for 9 years. She knew what it looked like. She filled his prescription on a Thursday afternoon and watched him leave. She also said nothing. Not because she didn't care, because there was nothing in the system as it existed that told her what to do next. Ryan took 2 tablets that evening, one extra above his new self-imposed norm, and felt briefly like the version of himself he was at 22. The thought arrived cleanly. He wanted to feel that way again tomorrow. That thought would keep arriving. For a long time, it would keep arriving. By month 5, Ryan had a system. It had not been designed deliberately. It had accumulated the way habits do, through small adjustments made for practical reasons that eventually locked into a fixed routine. The system had 3 components, and he ran it without thinking about it the way a person drives a familiar route without consciously reading the road signs. First, the pharmacy rotation. 4 pharmacies across a roughly 4-mile arc, the Boots on Roundhay Road, a small independent on Hare Hills Lane, a Well pharmacy near the Seacroft Ring Road, and an Lloyd's pharmacy inside the Asda on York Road. He visited each no more than once every 10 days. He paid attention to which counter staff recognised him and adjusted his timing accordingly. The pharmacist at the Boots on Roundhay Road, the one who had started watching his face, he now visited only on the days she was clearly not on shift, which he had worked out from her pattern of presence across 6 weeks of careful observation. He was not aware that he had been doing this. He would not have been able to articulate it as surveillance. It was just something he knew. Second, the timing. DHC Continuous, the slow-release version, prescribed in 60 mg and 90 mg tablets, was available on prescription for patients where the standard immediate-release tablets had been deemed insufficient. Ryan had told a locum GP in March that the 30 mg tablets were no longer managing his pain effectively. This was technically true. It was true because his tolerance had risen to the point where 30 mg produced almost no perceptible effect at all. The locum prescribed DHC continuous 60 mg without requesting a pain management referral, because the wait for those was 22 weeks, and the patient in front of him was a functional adult describing a legitimate occupational injury. Ryan did not take the continuous tablets as prescribed. He crushed them. This is what defeating the formulation means. A slow-release tablet is engineered to dissolve over a controlled period, 8 hours, 12 hours, depending on the compound. The mechanism is in the physical structure of the tablet itself. Crush it, and that structure is destroyed. The full dose delivers immediately, in a single wave rather than a graduated release, hitting the bloodstream and the brain's opioid receptors at a concentration the tablet was specifically designed to prevent. The pharmaceutical companies knew this was possible when they designed the formulations. They had tried to make the tablets harder to crush. The effort was only partially successful. A spoon and 30 seconds of pressure were sufficient. Ryan crushed them on the back of a hardback book, a novel Stacy had left on the bedside table, its spine uncracked, and washed the powder down with water before his shift. The effect was not subtle. It was not the background warmth of the first months. At 60 mg delivered instantly to a nervous system that was now calibrated around regular opioid exposure, the sensation was something closer to what the word euphoria actually means. A full-body release, a loosening of something that had been wound tight without Ryan noticing it was wound at all. It lasted 3 hours. Then it was gone, and what came after it was the absence, which was its own particular texture. The absence was the problem. More specifically, the absence was the beginning of the problem that would eventually become the only problem. Across Leeds, in a drop-in centre run by a charity called StreetLink North, a harm reduction worker named Donna Fielding was halfway through an intake assessment with a 31-year-old man who had just disclosed his primary drug as dihydrocodeine. Donna had been doing this work for 11 years. She had a system too. Intake forms, risk assessments, naloxone training, the careful language of harm reduction that withheld judgment as a professional discipline. But the 31-year-old in front of her was the 6th person in 8 weeks who had named DHC as their primary substance, not as a secondary drug alongside heroin or crack. Primary, the thing they structured their days around. 11 years ago, this would have been unusual enough to note and discuss with colleagues. 8 years ago, it would still have been uncommon. Now she was noting it and discussing it with colleagues, and beginning to wonder whether discussion was still a proportionate response. She finished the intake assessment. She made the man a cup of tea. She pulled up a spreadsheet on her work laptop that she maintained separately from the charity's official database. Tracking disclosure patterns her own way, she typed DHC primary, male, 31, no prior opioid treatment, prescription origin. Then she scrolled up. The column for prescription origin, meaning the person had first encountered DHC through a legitimate GP prescription rather than buying it on the street, had 15 entries in the past 4 months. 15 people who had come through a doctor's door with pain and left with a box of tablets that had eventually led them, by routes none of them had anticipated, to a harm reduction centre in Leeds. She stared at the number. The street supply of DHC was a separate current running alongside the prescription route, and it had its own architecture. In Sheffield, roughly 9 miles from Dr. Mita's surgery and 20 miles from Ryan's flat, a man named Tommy Briggs had built something he would not have called a business, but that functioned as one. Tommy was 34. He'd worked for 7 years as a healthcare assistant in an NHS ward in Rotherham. Patient care, bed management, medication rounds, until a disciplinary process in 2022 ended his contract over an undisclosed conduct matter. The conduct matter was not related to drugs. He had struggled after leaving. No qualification beyond his HCA training, a rented room in a shared house in Darnall, intermittent cash-in-hand work. He had started using DHC himself in 2023 after a knee injury, in the same way that Ryan had started. His GP was not a locum. His GP was a regular, overpressured NHS doctor with a list of 2,400 patients who had issued the prescription during an appointment that ran 11 minutes over schedule. Tommy's route diverged from Ryan's at a specific point. He had discovered, through an online forum he had stumbled onto while searching for information about his own prescription, that other people wanted DHC and could not access it easily. The forum, hosted on a subdomain of a broader harm reduction website, operating in the ambiguous space between peer support and drug market, had threads dedicated to DHC sourcing, tips on which pharmacies were less alert, discussion of prescription quantities and GP strategies, and nested within those threads private message chains where supply and demand found each other quietly. Tommy began selling his surplus, 10 tablets a month, then 20, then 60. By the start of 2024, he was aggregating from 2 additional sources, people he had met through the forum who had legitimate prescriptions and were willing to sell what they didn't personally use. By spring 2024, he had 4 regular buyers and was moving approximately 200 tablets per month. The price was £1 per 30 milligram tablet, £1 and 20 pence for the continuous. This was not significant money in the context of harder drug markets. Heroin moved at different magnitudes, but DHC's appeal to Tommy as a product was precisely its low profile. The buyers were not street users in any recognizable sense. The transactions happened through bank transfer or cash left in locations rather than hand-to-hand exchanges, and the legal risk was categorically lower than supply of Class A substances. What DHC cost the buyers was often not money. It was time and humiliation and the relentless arithmetic of need. The daily calculation of how many tablets remained, how many days until the prescription could be refilled, how wide the gap was between those 2 numbers. Ryan discovered Tommy's existence through the same forum in April 2024. He did not purchase immediately. He read the threads for 3 weeks before sending a message. He told himself he was just gathering information. The first purchase was 40 tablets. He collected them from a car park in Beeston in a transaction that lasted less than 4 minutes. The tablets were in a small Ziploc bag inside a plain envelope. He put the envelope in his jacket pocket and drove home without turning the radio on. He had one thought, clear and quiet, on the motorway home. He now had enough to last until his next prescription. That was what he told himself. And at the moment he thought it was true. The problem with that thought was not that it was false. The problem was that it would also be true next month, and the month after that, and that the definition of enough would keep recalibrating upward in perfect step with his tolerance, and that the recalibration had no natural ceiling. At work on a Saturday 3 days later, Ryan miscounted a pallet. 24 units registered, 22 physically present. His manager noticed during the inventory check and mentioned it, lightly, the way a manager mentions a small error from someone who doesn't normally make small errors. Ryan laughed it off. The laugh was easy, unforced. But when he went to the bathroom 5 minutes later, he took his remaining tablets from his jacket pocket and counted them. He had been certain there were 9. There were 6 fewer than that. He stood under the fluorescent light of the warehouse bathroom and counted again. 3 times. The number did not change. Stacy noticed the scratching first. Not dramatic scratching. Not the kind that leaves marks. A slow, absent-minded dragging of fingernails along his forearm while he watched television. The way someone might tap a finger on a table without knowing they were doing it. She mentioned it once, lightly. Ryan looked at his arm as though surprised to find his hand there, stopped, and didn't do it again that evening. By the following week it was back. The same arm, the same unconscious motion, always when he was sitting still. The scratching is a known opioid effect. Not everyone experiences it. It depends on the individual's histamine response to the drug, but it is common enough to be listed in the clinical literature. The opioid receptors in the skin become sensitized. The brain interprets signals from nerve endings differently. The result is persistent low-grade itch that the person experiencing it often cannot locate precisely and scratches without conscious intention. Stacy did not know this. She worked in GP administration, not clinical medicine. She scheduled appointments, managed records, handled the operational layer of a healthcare system she understood structurally but not pharmacologically. She found the empty DHC box under the bathroom sink on a Tuesday morning in June 2024. Behind the spare toilet rolls, pushed back against the wall. She held it for a moment, read the label, Ryan's name, the surgery's address, the dosage instructions, and placed it in the recycling. She had a logical frame available, his back, the prescription, the physiotherapy he'd mentioned finishing months ago. She used the frame. It was the frame that made most sense with the information she had. What she did not have, the knowledge that Ryan's back pain had been rated a 2 out of 10 by his physiotherapist at their final session in February, and that the physiotherapist had written in her discharge notes that further analgesia was unlikely to be clinically necessary. That document existed in Ryan's NHS record. It had been filed correctly. No GP had cross-referenced it with the repeat prescription request since February. The NHS record system contains everything. The system does not automatically read itself. Ryan was sleeping differently by June. Not less, sometimes more, 10 or 11 hours on days off, a heaviness that was hard to interrupt once it took hold. Other nights he didn't sleep at all, lying rigid in the dark, legs moving with a restless urgency that he described to Stacy when she noticed and asked, as just being wired from nights. Shift workers often had disrupted sleep. This was true. It was also a recognizable symptom pattern. The alternating extremes of opioid effect and early withdrawal cycling across a 24-hour period as the drug's half-life played out. His appetite had changed. He refused dinner 3 nights in a row and didn't mention being hungry, which was unusual for a man who had previously eaten 2 meals before a shift. Stacy made a pasta dish on a Thursday that he'd always liked, and he ate 4 forkfuls and pushed the rest around the bowl. She didn't press it. She stored the leftovers. She noticed. There were other things she noticed and did not store in words. The way the bathroom cabinet had reorganized itself, the DHC box now at the back, behind other things, where it had previously sat out. The way Ryan had started locking his phone screen when she walked into the room, a gesture so small and so quick that she couldn't be sure she'd seen it. The way he had stopped complaining about his back entirely, which should have been reassuring but landed differently. Because for months the back had been the thing he mentioned, the explanation he reached for, and its sudden absence from his conversation felt less like recovery, and more like a subject that had been quietly retired. Meanwhile, in Rotherham, Dr. Priya Mehta had done the thing the system had not. She had read her own notes. In the 6 weeks since she had flagged the DHC pattern to her practice manager and received the polite, measured, unactionable response, she had been keeping a secondary list. Not in the NHS record system, which she had no authority to annotate across patient files in aggregate, but in a physical notebook she kept in her desk drawer. Names, dates, prescription quantities, refill intervals. 8 patients now. 8 in a single GP practice in a single year, with DHC usage patterns that fell outside the expected therapeutic range. She had brought this to the practice manager a second time. The practice manager had listened more carefully on this occasion and had suggested escalating to the NHS South Yorkshire Integrated Care Board with a formal concern submission. The submission process involved a form. The form had 17 fields. Dr. Mehta had started filling it in 3 times and been interrupted 3 times by clinical emergencies that took clear priority over paperwork. The form sat in her drafts folder, partially completed. Donna Fielding at Streetlink North in Leeds had moved past the stage of noting the pattern and into something more deliberate. Her personal spreadsheet, the one tracking DHC disclosures, now had 43 entries. 43 individuals who had disclosed DHC as a primary or significant secondary substance at the drop-in centre since January. Against the same period in the previous year, 11. She'd begun writing a formal report, not a spreadsheet note, a document structured with an executive summary and a data section and a recommendations page. The kind of thing designed to move upward through organisations rather than sit on a desk. She wrote it during lunch breaks and on Tuesday evenings in the charity's empty office, under fluorescent light, with a cup of tea that went cold before she remembered it was there. The report documented something specific. The demographic profile of DHC presentations at Streetlink North was unlike anything her service had recorded for other opioids. Average age 31, 73% employed or recently employed. 68% had a verifiable prescription history, meaning DHC had entered their lives through a legal medical encounter, not through street purchase. Only 14% had prior drug treatment episodes. These were not people the system had previously flagged as at risk. That was the point she kept returning to, sitting under the fluorescent light on Tuesday evenings. The system that existed to identify people at risk of opioid dependency had not been built for this population, because this population had not existed in these numbers before. The risk criteria were designed around a different profile, younger, from more deprived backgrounds, with existing involvement in drug markets. DHC in 2024 was producing a new profile. The existing tripwires weren't positioned to catch it. She finished a draft of the report in July. She asked her line manager to review it. Her line manager read it in 2 sittings, found it credible, and sent it to the charity's senior leadership with a recommendation that it be submitted to Leeds City Council's public health team. Senior leadership approved the submission in August. 1 month later than intended, because August contained a funding review and a trustee meeting, and the loss of a community outreach worker to a better-paid NHS post. Ryan did not know about Donna's report. He did not know about Dr. Mehta's notebook. He was not a data point in either document because he had never attended a harm reduction service, and his GP appointments had produced no flag visible to anyone compiling aggregate patterns. He was, by July 2024, consuming approximately 180 milligrams of DHC per day. This was 3 times the standard therapeutic dose and 60 milligrams above the ceiling that even high-tolerance chronic pain patients were typically managed at in specialist settings. He was sourcing the shortfall, the gap between his prescription and his daily requirement, from Tommy Briggs and from a second, newer source he had found through the same forum, a pharmacy-adjacent community he had not known existed 6 months earlier. On a Saturday in July, he miscounted a second pallet at work. This time, the error was caught by a team member, not his manager, and the team member corrected it without mentioning it to anyone. Ryan noticed. He said nothing. At home that night, while Stacey slept, he sat at the kitchen table and opened his phone's notes app, not to record anything, but to look at a calculation he had made 3 days earlier and hadn't deleted. It was a simple sum, the number of tablets he needed per day, multiplied by 30, minus the number his prescription provided monthly, equaling the number he had to source from elsewhere. The number he needed to source was 112 per month. He stared at it under the kitchen light. The number had been 60 when he had first written a version of this calculation 4 months ago. He closed the app. He went to bed. Stacey woke briefly when he got in, registered his presence, and went back to sleep. She'd worked a long day. Her breathing settled within 2 minutes, slow and even. Ryan lay on his back and stared at the ceiling and waited for his legs to stop moving. They stopped around 4 a.m. By then he had already counted 3 times the tablets left in his pocket. He'd been certain there were 8. There were 5. He did not sleep. At 6 a.m. he heard Stacey's alarm go off in the dark and watched her get up and go to shower and come back and get dressed and leave for work without knowing that he was awake. She left the kitchen light on, as always. He was still watching the ceiling when the front door closed. Donna Fielding submitted her report to Leeds City Council's public health team on a Friday afternoon in late August. The submission was received automatically and assigned a case reference number. The public health inbox received 47 submissions that week. The team had 3 staff members active over the bank holiday weekend. The report sat in the queue, unread. The DHC street market in northern England in late 2024 did not look like a drug market. There were no corners, no lookouts, no visible exchange of anything between anyone. It operated through the same channels people used to sell second-hand furniture or arrange car shares, private messages, forum threads, brief cash transactions in car parks and supermarket foyers, and the car parks of retail parks where CCTV covered entrances, but not the far rows of spaces where people had learned to stand. It was quiet, transactional, and almost entirely invisible to the enforcement infrastructure designed to detect drug supply, because that infrastructure had been calibrated for substances with a different profile and a different market architecture. Tommy Briggs had not built this. He was a node in something that had assembled itself. By September 2024, his operation had expanded in a direction he had not initially planned. The 2 additional prescription sources he had been aggregating from, users with legitimate scripts who sold their surplus, had been joined by 2 more. One was a retired man in his 60s from Mexborough who had been prescribed DHC Continuous for degenerative disc disease and who sold half his monthly allocation for cash to cover a heating bill that had been arriving in amounts he couldn't manage alone since his wife died. The other was a woman in her late 30s from Barnsley who worked as a care assistant in a residential home and who had begun, gradually and then systematically, diverting tablets from residents' medication supplies. Her name does not appear in any public record connected to this period. She has not been charged with anything related to DHC supply. She's included here not by name but by function, because what she was doing was not incidental to the supply chain. It was structural. The residents whose medication she was diverting had genuine pain conditions: arthritis, post-surgical pain, the compounding physical deterioration of people in their 70s and 80s whose bodies had been wearing out for decades. Their DHC prescriptions were legitimate, clinically indicated, and carefully documented. The documentation recorded that the medication had been administered. The medication had not always been administered. The gap between those two facts, between the recorded dose and the actual dose, was being converted into cash and passed to Tommy Briggs at 70 pence per tablet, a price that reflected both the volume and the risk. The residents felt more pain than their records indicated they should. One of them, a 78-year-old woman named Margaret, who'd been at the home since her hip replacement the previous spring, had been complaining to staff about inadequate pain control since August. Her complaints were documented. They were attributed to anxiety and adjustment difficulties. Her DHC dose was not reviewed upward because her record showed she was already receiving the prescribed amount. She was not receiving the prescribed amount. Margaret's situation was not yet connected to anything. It would not be connected for months. She was an elderly woman in a care home who was in more pain than she should have been, and the system around her recorded everything correctly except the thing that mattered. Ryan knew none of this. He knew Tommy as a source, reliable, discreet, never late, and the tablets he received were indistinguishable from pharmacy-dispensed DHC, because most of them had been pharmacy-dispensed DHC. The supply chain's origin was invisible to the person at the end of it. His daily intake had reached 240 milligrams by October 2024, 4 times the standard therapeutic dose. He had crossed, without a ceremony or a threshold moment, into a range that specialist pain clinicians would classify as high-dose opioid dependency, requiring managed reduction under medical supervision. He had not seen a specialist. He had seen a rotating sequence of locum GPs, none of whom had his full picture. The physical changes were accumulating. His face had changed in a way that people who saw him regularly hadn't noticed, but that his mother, Janet, registered immediately when he visited Bradford for a Sunday dinner in October, the first time she'd seen him in 3 months. His cheekbones were more prominent. Not dramatically, not alarmingly to a stranger, but to a woman who had been looking at that face for 29 years, something had shifted. He ate normally at her table, which surprised her. He was engaged, present, talked about work. She let the observation settle at the back of her mind without turning it into a question. She did not know, sitting across the table from her son, that her younger son was also in the room in an indirect sense. Callum was 24, living in a shared house in Bradford with 3 other people his age. He had been working in a warehouse too, not Ryan's, a different logistics firm on the other side of the city. He had called Ryan 6 weeks earlier about a knee problem that had flared up during a shift. Ryan had listened, had mentioned his own experience with DHC, had said it had genuinely helped with the pain and the long hours. He had sent Callum 20 tablets from his own supply, not sold, given. He had told Callum they were perfectly safe, they were prescribed, they were from a pharmacy, they were not a street drug. Callum had taken his first tablet on a Tuesday evening in September. Janet knew none of this. Ryan knew none of what would follow from it. He ate his dinner and drove back to Leeds and did not think about those 20 tablets again. The supply chain had just added a branch. Back in Leeds, the situation between Ryan and Stacey had reached a particular kind of impasse. The sort that exists not in arguments, but in the spaces between them. They were not fighting. They had not had a significant confrontation about the DHC, since Stacey had found the empty box in June and accepted Ryan's explanation. The explanation had not changed. The back, the prescription, the shifts. What had changed was smaller and harder to name. Ryan had started checking the post before Stacey saw it. Pharmacy letters, the occasional NHS notification. He had moved his main tablet stash from behind the floorboard in the bedroom to a Ziploc bag inside his gym bag, which Stacey never touched because Ryan had not been to the gym in 8 months and the bag lived at the back of the wardrobe. He had started keeping a secondary stash in the car, 8 tablets in a contact lens case in the glove box, in case he miscalculated and ran short somewhere he couldn't return home from quickly. Planning for contingencies, managing variables. The architecture of concealment had grown more sophisticated without Ryan making a deliberate decision to construct it. It had grown the way the pharmacy rotation had grown, through small, rational adjustments, each one reasonable in isolation. Stacey found a second stash on an evening in November. She had not been looking for it. She had gone to the wardrobe for a jumper that had ended up through the drift of laundry inside Ryan's gym bag. She pulled the bag forward, unzipped it for the jumper, and found the Ziploc bag pressed flat against the bag's inner lining. 23 tablets, the continuous version, the oblong film-coated ones, clearly different from the small round tablets of a standard 30-milligram prescription. She sat on the edge of the bed with the bag in her hand for 4 minutes before Ryan came upstairs. What followed was not an argument in the way arguments usually arrive. Raised voices, escalating accusations. It was quieter than that, which made it worse, Ryan explained. He was measured, logical, and wrong in ways Stacey could feel but not yet fully articulate. His back, the prescription, the fact that the continuous was stronger and meant he needed fewer tablets per day, the fact that he kept them in the bag because the bathroom cabinet didn't lock and the flat had had a maintenance worker through twice that month. Each explanation arrived cleanly, without hesitation, connected to the next. Stacey held the bag while he talked. She asked him when the back had last actually hurt. He told her last week. She asked him to show her the current prescription. He said it was at the pharmacy, that he'd collected it in parts because of their dispensing system. She accepted this. She was not equipped, in that moment, to disbelieve someone she had lived alongside for 3 years. But she kept the Ziploc bag on her side of the bed that night. In the morning she put it back in the gym bag. She did not say why. Meanwhile, the DHC pattern was spreading past the cities. Harm reduction workers in Harrogate, a market town, affluent by Yorkshire measures, not a place anyone associated with drug epidemics, had begun noting DHC disclosures at their small community service. In rural Powys in Wales, a community pharmacist had flagged to her local health board that 3 patients from 2 different GP practices had collected DHC prescriptions at her pharmacy within the same week, all from out-of-area surgeries, which was unusual for a town of 4,000 people. The health board acknowledged the flag. The acknowledgement did not trigger a review. Tommy Briggs received a message through the forum in late November from a buyer he had not dealt with before. The buyer wanted 200 tablets in a single purchase, the largest single order Tommy had ever received. The message was specific about formulation, about the continuous version, about timing. Tommy did not know who the buyer was. The forum operated through usernames. He looked at the number, 200 tablets, at £1.20 each, and replied that he could manage it within 2 weeks. He did not ask who the buyer was. He did not need to know. That was the point of how this worked. Nobody needed to know anything beyond their own piece of it. Dr. Mehta's partially completed form was still in her drafts folder. She opened it on a Wednesday evening in November, determined to finish it, and got through 4 more fields before her phone rang with a call from the out-of-hours GP service, asking if she could cover a session on Friday. She said yes. She closed the laptop, the forms saved automatically. Draft. Last edited 8:47 p.m. Donna Fielding's report had been in the Leeds City Council queue for 11 weeks. On the Monday after the bank holiday, a public health officer named Sarah had opened it, read the executive summary and marked it urgent. She had forwarded it to her team leader with a covering note. The team leader was on annual leave until the following Monday. The report moved upward, one level, and stopped. Somewhere in Bradford, Callum Callow was on his third prescription. He had told his own GP, a different surgery, a different part of the NHS, no connection to Ryan's records, that he had a knee injury from warehouse work. The GP had asked him to rate the pain. He said 7. He was not lying, not entirely. The knee had hurt once. It had largely stopped hurting 6 weeks ago. His prescription said 30 tablets, 30 milligrams, monthly supply. He had taken 41 in the past 18 days. The midpoint of this story arrives not with a single revelation, but with a question about a care home in Barnsley. Tommy Briggs had been supplying DHC steadily through the autumn of 2024, and the operation structure had held because its components were separated. The retired man from Mexborough, the care home worker, 2 other prescription holders, and his buyers, none of whom knew each other, none of whom communicated laterally. The architecture was not sophisticated by design. It was separated by accident, by the nature of how it had assembled itself through anonymous forum messages and brief car park transactions. Compartmentalization without intention. It worked the same way regardless. The large November order, 200 tablets, had come from a username that Tommy had not seen on the forum before. The buyer had known the right language, the right formulation specifics, the right way to establish credibility without providing identity. Tommy had filled the order from 3 sources simultaneously, including the care home worker, who had increased her diversion rate that month to meet the demand. The care home's medication records for November showed full dispensing compliance. Every resident's chart initialed, every dose logged, every box accounted for by count. The records were correct in every measurable sense. What the records could not capture was whether the tablets logged as administered had reached the mouths they were logged as reaching. Margaret's pain had become visible to other staff by November, not through her records, through her behaviour. She had stopped participating in the home's afternoon social sessions, which she had previously attended reliably. She was sleeping more during the day. She had stopped eating full meals, leaving half a plate on 3 consecutive days, which a care worker noted in her daily log as possible appetite change. Monitor. The care worker was not a clinician. She was observant and conscientious and operating within the limits of her training, which did not include opioid pharmacology. A visiting GP reviewed Margaret in late November. He adjusted her pain management plan. He increased her prescribed DHC dose. He noted that chronic pain in elderly patients often required upward titration over time, and that this was a normal progression. The increase was logged. The additional tablets entered the care home supply. They were documented as administered. Not all of them reached Margaret. She died in February 2025, 8 weeks after the GP visit. The cause of death recorded on her certificate was cardiorespiratory failure secondary to pneumonia, which was accurate. The coroner noted in a brief supplementary observation that inadequate mobility in the preceding months had likely contributed to her vulnerability to infection. Inadequate mobility was consistent with undertreated chronic pain. The coroner did not investigate the medication administration records. There was no reason to. They were correct on paper, and the death of a 78-year-old woman with a hip replacement and degenerative joint disease was not clinically surprising. No connection was drawn between Margaret's death and Tommy Briggs. No connection was drawn between Tommy Briggs and the care home worker. The care home worker attended Margaret's small funeral. She stood at the back. She said nothing to anyone. Ryan did not know any of this. He was 40 miles north, running his own parallel calculation. By January 2025, his daily intake had stabilized, if stabilized is the right word, which it may not be, at around 240 milligrams. Not because his need had plateaued, but because 240 milligrams was approximately the ceiling of what his supply chain could reliably deliver. He had hit a structural limit before a physiological one. His body would have accommodated more. The supply couldn't provide it. The gap between what his body expected and what he could reliably obtain had begun producing something new: anxiety, not the background restlessness of the earlier months. A specific forward-pointing dread that arrived in the early afternoon when his morning dose was wearing off and he calculated how many hours remained until his next. He had started keeping a mental ledger, tablets on hand, days until prescription refill, Tommy's current availability, that ran continuously beneath whatever else he was doing. He checked it automatically, the way a person checks the fuel gauge on a long journey, except the checking never produced a reading that felt safe. At work in January, a near miss. A forklift pathway that Ryan was supposed to have cleared before the machine moved through a loading bay was not cleared. The driver stopped in time. The pallet was intact. Nobody was hurt. Ryan was standing 15 meters away when it happened, his attention somewhere else entirely, and when his manager called him into the office afterward, Ryan produced a credible account of the sequence of events that attributed the near miss to a communication breakdown between two team members rather than to his own lapse. His manager believed him, partly. She made a note in his file, first entry in 4 years, and told him it needed following up. Ryan walked back to the loading bay and stood in the space where the forklift had been. The cold air was coming in off the dock. His hands were completely still. He registered this as a good sign. He did not register that checking his hands for stillness was not something he had done before. The second storyline, Dr. Mehta, Donna fielding the systems trying and failing to process the pattern, had reached a convergence point of its own in early 2025. Donna's report had finally cleared its queue at Leeds City Council in September 2024, been escalated by the public health officer, cleared the team leader's desk in mid-October, and arrived at the desk of a senior public health analyst named Colin, who had read it in full by the first week of November. Colin had 23 reports in active review. He had ranked Donna's as third priority. He had written a response to StreetLink North in December, acknowledging the findings and requesting supplementary data on geographical distribution and age breakdown. Donna had provided the supplementary data in January 2025, 4 pages, meticulously sourced from her own records. Colin had received it and forwarded it, along with Donna's original report, to a contact at NHS England's National Drug Strategy Unit. The contact at NHS England had added it to a briefing document being prepared for a quarterly review meeting scheduled for March. The document contained 14 case studies from across England describing emerging drug use patterns. DHC was case study 11 of 14, in a quarterly briefing for a March meeting. Meanwhile, the Sheffield Star article had a journalist attached to it, a 26-year-old named Claire, who had been tipped off by a source at a harm reduction charity about unusual DHC patterns in South Yorkshire. She had been working the story for 2 months, quietly, collecting data, speaking to people off the record. She had requested an interview with Dr. Mehta through the surgery's official communications channel in December. The surgery's communications channel was managed by a part-time administrator who handled media requests alongside 3 other roles. Dr. Mehta received the forwarded request in January. She considered it for 4 days. She responded. The interview happened in February, in the surgery's waiting room after hours, with the chairs still arranged in their daytime configuration and the hand sanitizer dispensers empty at the end of a Friday. Dr. Mehta spoke carefully and on background, meaning Claire could use the information but not attribute it directly to her by name. She described the prescribing pattern, the 8 patients, the early refill requests, the fact that she had flagged it internally and received no actionable response. She described the gap between what the prescription monitoring system was designed to catch and what it was actually catching. Claire had found a second source by then, a community pharmacist in Sheffield who described the same pattern from the dispensing side. She had also found data, NHS Business Services Authority prescription figures, available publicly in aggregate, showed DHC dispensing volumes in West Yorkshire and South Yorkshire had increased by 34% between 2022 and 2024. Not 34% against a low baseline, against an already substantial one. The article was published in the Sheffield Star on a Tuesday in March 2025. It ran on page 7. The headline was measured, not sensational. Something about opioid prescribing concerns in South Yorkshire. It was the kind of article that people who already knew about the problem would recognise as important, and that people who didn't would skip past on the way to the football results. Dr. Mehta received 3 emails about it before lunch on the day it published. One was from her practice manager, who was concerned about the surgery being identifiable despite the anonymous sourcing. One was from a colleague at another practice who had seen the same pattern and had never mentioned it to anyone. The third was from an NHS communications officer asking her to direct future media inquiries through official channels. None of these emails were from NHS England's Drug Strategy Unit. Tommy Briggs, in Sheffield, read the article on his phone while waiting for a bus. He read it once, quickly, and put the phone in his pocket. He didn't read it again. His care home contact had gone quiet in February, 2 weeks after Margaret's funeral. She had stopped responding to forum messages. She had not sent an explanation. The supply line she represented had simply closed, the way supply lines do when a person decides, without announcement, that they are finished with something. Tommy's operation contracted. He had 2 active prescription sources remaining, and the Mexborough man, whose supply was modest. The 200-tablet order from the anonymous buyer in November had not been repeated. What Tommy did not know, what he would not know until March, when it arrived without warning, was that the care home worker had not merely stopped supplying. She had been noticed, not by the police, by a colleague at the care home who had found a discrepancy in the medication stock during a routine internal audit, and had raised it with the home's manager. The manager had raised it with the care home's parent company. The company had launched an internal investigation. The investigation had not yet connected the discrepancy to diversional supply. It was currently framed as an administrative error. Someone had miscounted. It happened. But the audit trail was open, and audit trails, once opened, do not close themselves. Ryan received a phone call from his mother Janet on a Saturday in February 2025. A call he almost didn't take because his phone was in his jacket and he was in the middle of counting his tablets. He took it. Janet asked how he was. He said fine. She asked if he'd spoken to Callum recently. Ryan said not for a couple of weeks. There was a pause in the conversation, the kind of pause that carries weight without words. Janet said Callum seemed different lately. Ryan asked different how. She said she wasn't sure. She said she thought maybe he was struggling with work. Ryan made a sound of acknowledgement and said he'd give Callum a ring. He did not give Callum a ring. He put the phone back in his pocket and returned to the count. 17 tablets. 3 days until his prescription could be refilled. Tommy's last message had said he'd have stock by Thursday. The numbers worked. Just about. They had been just about working for 4 months. He had not thought about the 20 tablets he sent Callum in September since the week after he sent them. He would not think about them again until something forced him to, and that forcing was coming, though Ryan could not see it from where he stood in his kitchen in February, phone in pocket, 17 tablets between him and something he did not yet have a name for. Callum's flatmate in Bradford had noticed something too. She had not said anything yet. She was 23 years old, and she did not know what she was looking at. She was beginning to. Tommy Briggs's supply chain broke on a Wednesday in March 2025. Not dramatically, not with an arrest or a raid or any of the visible ruptures that drug supply narratives usually pivot around. It broke the way most things break under sustained pressure, quietly, at the weakest point, with no announcement. The care home investigation in Barnsley had widened. What had started as an administrative discrepancy in a medication stock audit had, over 6 weeks, become something the home's parent company could no longer classify as a counting error. The numbers didn't resolve into human mistake. They resolved into pattern, specific residents, specific medications, specific shifts, the same initials appearing on administration records during windows when the stock count didn't hold. The company's internal investigator had handed the file to their legal team. The legal team had contacted the Care Quality Commission. The CQC had notified the local police. The care home worker was suspended on a Tuesday. The police visit came on Thursday. She had not contacted Tommy. She would not contact Tommy. The connection between her and his operation existed only in forum messages sent through a platform that automatically deleted threads after 60 days, and in the private knowledge of 2 people who had every reason to keep it private. The police investigation was focused on the care home, on the medication records, on the residents. It was a healthcare fraud investigation, not a drug supply investigation. Tommy did not know he was adjacent to a police investigation. He knew only that his highest volume source had gone silent. He recalculated. Without the care home supply, his monthly volume dropped by approximately 140 tablets. The retired man from Mexborough was reliable but modest. 60 tablets per month, split from his own prescription. His 2 remaining forum sources were variable. He sent messages to both on Thursday morning, requesting increased volume. One replied within the hour. The other didn't reply for 4 days, and when the reply came it was brief. They were stepping back. Tommy's operation, at its November peak, had been moving roughly 300 tablets per month. By the end of March it was moving 90. This mattered to Ryan in a direct and immediate way, though he did not yet know why the supply had contracted. Tommy's message in late March was short. Less available this month. Prices up slightly. 2 weeks wait minimum. Ryan read it on his phone in the warehouse car park before a shift, sitting in the dark in his car with the engine running for warmth. He did the calculation. His prescription provided 90 milligrams per day on paper. His actual consumption was 240 milligrams. The gap was 150 milligrams daily, 5 30 milligram tablets that had to come from outside the prescription. Tommy's reduced supply covered perhaps half that gap. The other half had to come from somewhere else. This was the first time the mathematics of Ryan's situation had no immediate solution. He sat in the car for 11 minutes. Then he went to work. What he did over the following 2 weeks constituted what harm reduction workers called, in their training materials and case notes, a pharmacy run, though Ryan had not encountered that term and would not have applied it to himself. He identified 3 pharmacies in different NHS Trust catchment areas, at distances between 4 and 14 miles from his flat. He spaced his visits across a single Monday, timing them with the care of someone planning a logistics route, which was a skill he had developed over 4 years of night shift warehouse work. He collected his own prescription from his registered pharmacy first. Then he visited the second, presenting a printed prescription that he had obtained, the mechanism of which requires its own explanation, through an online consultation service that operated across NHS trust boundaries and had, until recently, issued DHC prescriptions following a self-reported pain assessment delivered by online form. These online consultation services, sometimes called digital GP platforms, had expanded rapidly in the years following the pandemic. They were legitimate NHS commissioned services designed to reduce pressure on face-to-face GP appointments. Most operated responsibly. Some had prescribing oversight that was adequate. A minority had oversight that was thinner than the service's interface suggested. A questionnaire algorithm, a pharmacist sign-off, a prescription issued without a human clinician reviewing the patient's full NHS history. Ryan had found one of the thinner ones on the same forum where he had found Tommy. The process had taken 20 minutes and £29. The prescription was technically valid. The pharmacist at the second pharmacy on Ryan's Monday route had no system flag to tell her that the patient in front of her had collected a prescription for the same drug at another pharmacy 4 hours earlier. The third pharmacy was the one on Kirkgate, attached to the Tesco. Ryan arrived there at 4 p.m. The pharmacist ran his NHS number. A flag appeared. Not a refusal, a soft alert, indicating a recent prescription for the same medication at a nearby location. The pharmacist queried it. Ryan explained smoothly and without visible anxiety that his regular pharmacy had been out of stock. This happened. It was a credible explanation because it was sometimes true for other people. The pharmacist dispensed the prescription with a note on the system. He left with 9 more tablets. In the car park, he sat with the 3 receipts on the passenger seat and counted his total haul. Enough for 4 days, perhaps 5 if he was careful. He had not been careful for 8 months. He folded the receipts and put them in his jacket pocket. The body, at this level of dependency, does not offer much warning before withdrawal begins. The half-life of DHC is approximately 4 hours, meaning that 4 hours after the last dose, blood plasma concentration has halved. For a person consuming 240 milligrams daily, the descent is steep and fast. Symptoms begin not with dramatic physical collapse, but with something more insidious, a spreading unease, a low electrical feeling in the bones, a certainty that something is wrong that arrives before any specific symptom can be identified. Then the symptoms arrive. Sweating that soaks through a shirt without producing heat, yawning that comes in long, uncontrollable waves, a sensitivity to cold that makes a room feel like standing in a doorway in January regardless of the thermostat. Ryan had experienced mild versions of this for months, the uncomfortable afternoons before a dose, the restless nights. He had managed them with careful timing. The supply disruption in March was the first time managing them with careful timing had stopped working. On a Thursday night in late March he ran out. Not miscounted, not miscalculated, actually out. He searched the gym bag, the contact lens case in the glove box, a third location he kept in a coat pocket in the back of the wardrobe. He found 2 tablets. He took them both. By 2 a.m. the unease had returned. Not the mild version, something wider and more insistent, occupying his whole body from the inside. He was due at work at 9. By 6 a.m. he had vomited twice. Each time he sat on the bathroom floor afterward, back against the cold tiles and waited for it to pass. Stacey was asleep. He ran the tap to cover the sound and sat very still. His legs were doing the restless thing, but worse than usual. Not a background movement, but a compulsion, an urgent need to shift and reposition that provided no relief because the feeling was not in his legs exactly, just reaching him through them. He called in sick, first sick day in 19 months. He messaged Tommy at 7 a.m. Tommy replied at noon, nothing until the weekend at the earliest. Ryan spent Thursday in bed, which is where Stacey found him when she came home at 6. He told her it was a stomach bug. His skin was clammy in a way that stomach bugs do not usually produce. Not feverish, not warm, but sheened with moisture that felt cold to touch. She brought him water. She sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, looking at him in the particular way she'd been looking at him for months. Not alarm, but a sustained attention, the way a person watches something they cannot quite name. She went to make soup. He heard her in the kitchen. He picked up his phone and booked a GP appointment through the surgery's online portal. Next available, 11 days. 11 days. He put the phone face down on the pillow. The ceiling above the bed had a hairline crack running from the light fitting toward the window, a crack that had been there since they moved in, and that he had looked at thousands of times without seeing it. He saw it now. He followed it from one end to the other. Stacey brought soup at 7. He ate half. She asked if he needed anything else. He said no. She turned off the overhead light and left the bedside lamp on when she went back downstairs. He lay in the low light and understood, without being able to fully articulate it, that the 11-day wait was not a medical problem he could solve with patience. He had been in this building before, the structure of the problem, the arithmetic of need against supply, but never with the floor this far below him, never with the gap this wide. What he would do in the 11 days before his appointment was the question. The answer was already forming. It was not a good answer, but it was the only one the situation was offering him. Callum in Bradford ran out of tablets on the same Thursday night. He did not know Ryan had run out too. He did not call his brother. He lay on the floor of his bedroom, not the bed, the floor, because the floor felt less constricting, and stared at the base of his wardrobe and did not call anyone. His flatmate knocked on his door at 11 and got no answer. She stood in the hallway for a moment listening. She heard him moving. She went back to her room. She lay awake for an hour trying to decide what she was hearing and what it meant and what, if anything, she was supposed to do about it. The 3 days after running out were not the worst days of Ryan's life. They were the worst days of his life so far. Thursday had been the vomiting, the bathroom floor, the ceiling crack. Friday was different in quality, less acute, more total. The physical symptoms were not individually catastrophic. No single thing that was happening to his body would, in isolation, constitute an emergency. But they were happening simultaneously and without pause, layered over each other in a way that left no gap for recovery between them. The sweating had reached the point where his pillow needed turning every 2 hours. The yawning came in sequences of 8 or 10, each one pulling his jaw so wide it ached. His eyes watered constantly, not from emotion, from a neurological overflow that opioid withdrawal produces in some people, the body's signalling systems firing without proper cause. His skin registered the duvet as simultaneously too heavy and insufficient. He told Stacey on Friday morning that the stomach bug had moved to his chest. She left paracetamol on the bedside table. Paracetamol for a 240 mg per day opioid dependency and withdrawal. The gap between what was on the table and what was needed was not Stacey's fault. It was the gap produced by 17 months of careful concealment. She went to work. He waited until he heard the car leave. He had 3 options and he knew all 3 clearly, with the clarity that comes from having nothing else to think about during a long night on a damp pillow. First, wait. White-knuckle the 11 days until his GP appointment, reduce his consumption to prescription level once Tommy restocked, manage it down from there. This option had a specific problem. He had now been in withdrawal for 36 hours on a Friday morning, and Tommy's restock was not until the weekend at the earliest, and the earliest had a way of becoming later. Second, attend A&E and disclose. Present at Leeds General, explain the dependency, ask for medical support. This option required saying out loud, in a clinical setting, words he had not said to anyone. Third, find supply, not from Tommy, somewhere else, fast. He got dressed at 9 a.m. He put on clean clothes over a body that was still sweating. He drove to the first of the 3 pharmacies from Monday's run and tried to collect on a pretext. The pharmacist checked his record, saw Monday's collection, and declined politely. He drove to the second. Same result. The soft flag system had caught Monday's visit. The third pharmacy on Kirkgate had already noted the alert on his record from Monday afternoon. He did not try the Tesco. He sat in the car outside the second pharmacy and thought with the slow, lateral problem-solving of someone who has not slept properly in 4 days. The forum. Someone on the forum had mentioned 6 weeks ago in a thread he had read but not bookmarked. A seller in the Headingley area who operated outside the prescription circuit entirely. Street supply, not diverted prescriptions. The distinction mattered because Street Supply had no NHS system attached to it, no flags, no records. Ryan found the thread. It took 40 minutes of searching, his hands not entirely steady on the phone screen. He sent a message to the username listed. He waited in the car park. The reply came in 22 minutes. The meeting was arranged for that evening at a pub in Headingley. Not inside, but in the car park at the side away from the entrance. Ryan arrived first and waited. The man who arrived was not what Ryan's mind had constructed from the forum messages. He was unremarkable in the specific way that makes a person invisible in a crowd. Middle-aged, wearing a jacket with a supermarket logo that suggested he had just come off a shift somewhere. He produced a small paper bag from his jacket pocket. Ryan produced cash. The exchange lasted less than 90 seconds. In the bag, 30 tablets, white, oblong, scored down the centre. They looked like DHC continuous. The man had described them as DHC continuous 60 milligrams, and the physical description matched. Ryan took 2 in the pub car park, dry, before he reached his car. What happened in the following 30 minutes was not immediate. The drive home was unremarkable. He made tea. He sat at the kitchen table and waited for the familiar settling, the volume dropping, the restoration of whatever passed for equilibrium at this stage of his dependency. It did not arrive in the expected shape. Something arrived. It was faster than DHC. It was different in texture. Not the warm settling he had learned over 18 months, but something sharper, a wave rather than a tide, reaching him behind his eyes and in the backs of his hands and then everywhere simultaneously, in a way that made him grip the edge of the kitchen table. He sat very still. What Ryan did not know, sitting at the kitchen table on a Friday night, was that the tablets in the paper bag were not DHC continuous. They were pressed tablets, manufactured to look like a pharmaceutical product, using a pill press that produces convincing results to someone who has not worked in a dispensary. The active compound was not dihydrocodeine. It was a fentanyl analogue, not fentanyl itself, but a synthetic opioid from the same chemical family, many times more potent, detectable only through chemical analysis that nobody in a pub car park in Headingley was performing. Fentanyl analogues have been present in the UK drug supply since at least 2016. Their infiltration of the pressed pill market, tablets engineered to mimic prescription opioids, had accelerated sharply between 2023 and 2025 as supply chains for illicit fentanyl from Eastern Europe became more established, and as the demand for opioid-looking products increased in step with DHC misuse. A dose of fentanyl analogue that is lethal is invisible to the naked eye. It is a quantity that would not register as a speck on a thumbnail. Distributed unevenly through a pressed tablet, because the mixing process in illicit manufacturing is imprecise, it can be present in one tablet at a concentration that overwhelms the respiratory system, while the tablet next to it in the same batch contains almost none. Ryan had taken 2 tablets in the car park. He sat at the kitchen table. His breathing was slowing in a way he had no reference point for. He was not unconscious. He was somewhere between consciousness and the absence of it, a state that had a specific clinical name, opioid-induced respiratory depression, and a specific trajectory if uninterrupted. He didn't know his breathing had slowed. That is the nature of the thing. The sensation is not distress. It is the opposite of distress. It is a removal of everything that distress requires. The kitchen light was on. In Bradford, at approximately the same hour, Callum Callow was on his 3rd day without tablets and had not eaten since Wednesday. He was conscious. He was on the bathroom floor of his shared house, not from collapse but from the same instinct that had put Ryan on a cold floor 2 days earlier. The tiles were grounding in a way the bed was not. His flatmate, a young woman named Priya who worked checkout shifts at a Morrison's, had knocked on the bathroom door 4 times over the course of the evening. She could hear him. He was responsive, just. She stood in the hallway with her phone in her hand and tried to determine what she was looking at. She knew Callum took something. She did not know what. She did not know what withdrawal looked like, had no framework for it, had grown up in a household where drugs meant either cannabis or the occasional news story about heroin addicts. What she was hearing through a bathroom door did not match either of those categories. She thought about whether Callum was on probation. She was almost certain he wasn't, but almost certain was doing a lot of work. She had heard from somewhere she could no longer source that calling 999 about a drug situation could get someone arrested. This was not accurate. It was, however, a common enough belief in certain communities that it functioned as a barrier to calling, just as effectively as if it were true. She waited. The man from the Headingley pub car park had sold to 3 other people that same Friday. The paper bags were from the same batch, the same pressed tablets, the same uneven distribution of compound that made each one a separate calculation. 2 of the other buyers were together, a man and a woman in their late 20s, buying for the weekend, who had found the forum seller through the same thread Ryan had found. The 3rd buyer was a 31-year-old man from Armley, who had been managing a tramadol dependency and had switched sources after his GP had finally refused a further refill. All 4 transactions had happened within 90 minutes. Back in Leeds, the Tesco on Kirkgate opened at 6 the following morning. By 6:43, a cleaner was noting the stillness of a pair of white Air Force Ones in the gap beneath a cubicle door. Because here is what the pharmacy run had actually been. Ryan had woken on Saturday morning. How he had woken on Saturday morning is a fact the story returns to when it can be told fully, and had understood, with whatever part of his mind was operational, that he needed more tablets before the day was over. Not the fentanyl-pressed ones. Real DHC, or whatever he could approximate as real. The wave from Friday night had receded, leaving something behind it that was new and frightening and that he had no language for. He had driven to the first pharmacy when it opened. They had flagged his NHS number. He had driven to the second. Flagged. He had tried the third. The Tesco pharmacy had dispensed 9 tablets, noting the alert on his record. He had taken 3 in the car, 3 more on the bus home, because he had left the car somewhere and taken a bus, though the sequence of that decision was not entirely clear to him. The last 3 he had taken in a Tesco bathroom because his legs had stopped cooperating on the stairs to the ground floor, and a toilet cubicle was the nearest enclosed space with a door. The receipt in his pocket was from 3 pharmacies, 3 timestamps across a single morning. That detail is now complete. That loop is closed. But the man from the Headingley pub car park had sold to 3 others on Friday night, and Ryan was the only one of the 4 who had made it to a bathroom with a door that someone would eventually notice was occupied too long. Of the other 3, 2 survived. The man and the woman from Armley had each other, and the woman had recognised what was happening and called 999 within 4 minutes of the first sign. They were both in Leeds General Infirmary by 8 a.m. on Saturday. The third buyer, the 31-year-old from Armley, he was alone. He was not found until Sunday afternoon. The ambulance carrying Ryan left Kirkgate at 6:59 a.m. The paramedic who had administered naloxone in the bathroom was filling in the patient report form in the front seat. Under primary substance, she wrote, suspected opioid, unknown type. The receipt on the ambulance floor was face down. 3 pharmacy names, 3 timestamps, all face down. In Bradford, Priya had finally called 999 at 1 a.m. on Saturday, 42 minutes after the last time Callum had answered through the bathroom door. The dispatcher had told her to unlock the door if she could. She'd used a coin on the bathroom lock. Callum was on the floor, conscious, not coherent. His pupils were pinpoint. The tablets he had taken, the last of his prescription supply, legitimate DHC, not the Headingley batch, had produced respiratory depression in a body that, at 6 months of escalating use, had reached a level of dependency that made even his prescription dose dangerous when taken in a compressed window. The ambulance had taken 11 minutes. No naloxone had been available in the house. The paramedic administered it in the hallway. Callum was breathing normally by the time the ambulance reached Bradford Royal Infirmary, 42 minutes on a bathroom floor. 42 minutes during which the only variable separating him from the third buyer in Armley was the fact that Priya had eventually, despite everything she didn't know, picked up the phone. Janet Callow had been calling Ryan for 4 days. She had found out about Callum on Wednesday, not from Callum, from Priya, who had found Janet's number in Callum's phone contacts listed as Mum Bradford, and had called her on Thursday, frightened and not knowing who else to call. Janet had called Ryan immediately, then again, then twice on Friday, then twice more. 11 calls across 4 days, each one going to voicemail, each one carrying the thing she needed him to know, that Callum was in trouble, that she was frightened, that she needed Ryan to help her understand what was happening to her younger son. She did not know, making the 11th call at 11:17 p.m. on Friday, that Ryan was sitting at a kitchen table under a kitchen light, gripping the edge of the table with both hands, breathing at 8 breaths per minute. She did not know that the person she was calling to help her understand what was happening to Callum was not in a position to understand anything at all. Ryan spent 3 days in Leeds General Infirmary. The naloxone administered in the Tesco bathroom had reversed the respiratory depression within 90 seconds. That part was fast, clinical, effective. What followed was slower and considerably less comfortable. Naloxone does not merely reverse an overdose. It strips every opioid molecule from every receptor simultaneously, throwing the body into immediate total withdrawal with a speed that natural depletion never produces. Ryan came back to full consciousness on a hospital trolley in a corridor, surrounded by Saturday morning A&E noise, every system in his body registering the sudden absence at once. The duty doctor who assessed him was 29 years old, 1 year qualified, working her 4th consecutive 12-hour shift of the week. She was not unkind. She was operating at the outer edge of her capacity in a department that was at 140% occupancy before 8 a.m. She administered a buprenorphine bridging dose, buprenorphine being the medication used to manage opioid withdrawal in acute settings, occupying the same receptors without producing the same high, stabilizing the system while the dependency is assessed. Within 4 hours, Ryan's physical symptoms had reduced from acute to manageable. By afternoon, he was in a ward bed rather than a corridor trolley. The ward was a 4-bed bay. The man in the bed to Ryan's left was 73 and had been admitted for a hip fracture. The man to his right was in his 40s, unconscious, the specific quality of unconsciousness that draws curtains around a bed and hushed conversations from nursing staff. Ryan lay between them and stared at the ceiling, which was institutional white and had no hairline crack to follow. On Sunday, a clinical nurse specialist in substance use came to his bedside with a clipboard and a manner that contained no visible judgment. She sat in the plastic chair that visitors used and worked through a structured assessment when the dependency had started, what he was taking, how much, by what routes. Ryan answered all of it, not because he had decided to be honest, because the energy required to manage a story was not available to him. He was depleted in a way that went past tired, past ill, into something he had no previous reference point for. He answered her questions the way a person answers a doctor after a car accident, completely, because concealment requires resources that the body has already spent. The timeline she assembled from his answers was the first time anyone had laid the full sequence in front of him. November 2023, first prescription. December, first refill, first tolerance signs. January 2024, dose increase beginning. April, first external supply. July, 180 milligrams daily. October, 240 milligrams daily. March 2025, supply disruption, withdrawal, the Headingley transaction. 16 months. From a back injury and an 8-minute GP appointment to a hospital bed with a naloxone administration in his notes. He looked at the timeline on her clipboard. He had known all these facts individually. Assembled in sequence, they were something he had not seen before. The nurse specialist explained what buprenorphine treatment involved. A community prescription, regular check-ins, a structured reduction plan or long-term maintenance depending on the clinical picture. She mentioned a community drug treatment service in Leeds, gave him a leaflet, wrote a referral. She said the wait for a first appointment was currently 12 to 17 days. Stacey visited on Sunday afternoon. She sat in the plastic chair the nurse specialist had used and held her bag on her lap with both hands. Ryan told her the parts he had not told her before. Not all of them. Not the full architecture, not Tommy, not the forum, not the online prescription service, but the core of it. The dependency, the months of escalating dose, the fact that his back had not been the reason for a long time. He said it without looking at her directly, watching the window instead, where the sky over Leeds was the flat grey of a Sunday in early spring. She listened. She stayed for 2 hours. When she left, she squeezed his forearm once at the door and walked out without looking back. She did not visit on Monday. On Monday, a different nurse brought Ryan's phone from the personal effects bag at the nurses' station. 11 missed calls. He sat with the phone for a while before returning the call to his mother. The conversation lasted 6 minutes. Janet told him about Callum, the bathroom floor, Priya's call, Bradford Royal Infirmary, the Saturday night that had resolved into a Sunday morning with both of her sons in hospitals 30 miles apart. She had not known about Ryan until he was already admitted, because no one had thought to call her, and Ryan's phone had been in a property bag. She had found out from Stacey, who had called her on Sunday evening. Ryan listened to his mother describe the 42 minutes in Callum's bathroom and said very little. He had sent Callum 20 tablets in September. He had told Callum they were safe. He had not thought about those 20 tablets since the week he sent them, and the distance between that fact and the 42 minutes on Callum's bathroom floor was not a distance he could measure while lying in a hospital bed on a Monday afternoon. He did not call Callum. Tommy Briggs was arrested in the 3rd week of March, 11 days after Ryan's admission. The charge was not DHC supply. It was benefit fraud, a separate investigation that had been running for 4 months through the Department for Work and Pensions, triggered by an anonymous tip. The DHC operation appeared in the police report as background context, noted by the officer who searched Tommy's room in Darnall and found forum printouts, a cash ledger with quantities and initials but no full names, and 2 boxes of DHC continues that contained more tablets than his personal prescription could account for. The DHC material was noted, submitted as evidence, considered for a separate charge. No charge was brought. The quantities were not sufficient to trigger mandatory prosecution thresholds under the Misuse of Drugs Act for a Schedule 5 substance. Tommy's solicitor made representations. The CPS reviewed the file and concluded that prosecution for DHC supply, given the quantities and classification, was unlikely to meet the public interest threshold against the stronger benefit fraud charge. Tommy pleaded guilty to benefit fraud in May. He received a suspended sentence and a repayment order. He was not in prison. He was not publicly identified as a drug supplier. His forum username had been inactive since March and had not been connected to his legal name in any document that entered the public record. The care home investigation in Barnsley concluded in April. The care home worker was dismissed. The matter was referred to the Disclosure and Barring Service, barring her from future work with vulnerable adults. No criminal charges were pursued, on the basis that proving intent to supply beyond reasonable doubt, given the deletion of the forum messages and the absence of financial records connecting her to Tommy, was not achievable. The CQC issued an improvement notice to the care home. Medication administration procedures were reviewed and tightened. Margaret's case was not reopened. The coroner's record stood unchanged. The Sheffield Star article had run on page 7. In the days after Ryan's discharge, it ran on page 2 of a follow-up, because Dr. Mehta, whose surgery had received 3 patient inquiries about DHC safety in the week following the original article, had decided to speak on the record this time. Not at length, not with clinical detail about specific patients. A statement, 2 sentences, describing the prescribing pattern she had observed and the inadequacy of the monitoring response. The follow-up article was picked up by the Press Association and distributed to regional newspapers across England. It appeared in 16 publications over 2 days, each running a version of the same story. Opioid prescribing concern, Yorkshire doctor raises alarm, experts call for review. NHS, South Yorkshire Integrated Care Board, responded within 48 hours. A review of DHC prescribing patterns across South Yorkshire would be commissioned. Expected timeline to report, 8 months. Donna Fielding read the coverage on her laptop in the StreetLink North office on a Tuesday morning. Her report, submitted 7 months earlier, escalated 3 times, used as a case study in an NHS England briefing, was cited in one of the follow-up articles as an early warning that the system had not acted on quickly enough. She was not named. The charity was not named. The citation read, Harm Reduction Services in West Yorkshire had been tracking the pattern since early 2024. She closed the article. She opened her intake spreadsheet for the day. Tuesday's first appointment was a 34-year-old man from Beeston presenting with DHC as primary substance. Second appointment, a 26-year-old woman from Chapeltown. Third, a 41-year-old from Morley. 7 new DHC presentations that Tuesday, a record for the service. She typed the first entry. She made a cup of tea. She went to the waiting room and called the first name on the list. Ryan was discharged on a Thursday. He stood outside Leeds General Infirmary with a plastic bag containing his clothes from Saturday, a buprenorphine prescription printed on NHS paper, and a leaflet for the Community Drug Treatment Service, whose first available appointment was in 14 days. The sky was the same flat grey it had been when he arrived. He had a bus pass. He had his phone. He had £43 in his bank account because his warehouse had begun a formal investigation into the near miss in January, and he was currently suspended pending outcome. He stood on the pavement outside the hospital and looked at his phone. No missed calls. The kitchen light would not be on when he got home. Stacey had collected her things on Monday while he was still in the ward. She'd left a note. 2 sentences, no address. Nothing he hadn't already known was coming from the moment she left on Sunday without looking back. The note was on the kitchen table where Ryan had sat on a Friday night, gripping the edge, 8 breaths per minute, the kitchen light overhead. He got the bus. He looked out the window at Leeds moving past. The ring road, the retail parks, the terraced streets of Hare Hills where the flat was. He held the plastic bag on his lap. He did not look at his phone. The Headingley pub seller had provided tablets to 4 people on the Friday night. 2 had survived without medical intervention. The couple from Armley, who had recognised the signs and called immediately. Ryan had survived with medical intervention. The 4th buyer, the 31-year-old from Armley alone in his flat, had been found on Sunday afternoon by a letting agent conducting a routine inspection. The letting agent had used the emergency key because the flat had been silent for 2 days, and the post was stacked against the door. Ryan did not know about the 4th buyer until a Monday morning 3 weeks after his discharge, when a brief news item appeared in the Yorkshire Evening Post. No name, no photograph. A 31-year-old man found deceased in Armley, suspected drug-related death. Police not treating it as suspicious. He read it on his phone in the flat. Stacey's half of the wardrobe was empty behind him. The gym bag was still in the bottom of the wardrobe. The contact lens case was still in the glove box of his car. He read the article twice. Then he put the phone face down on the kitchen table. Outside, Leeds went about its Tuesday. Somewhere in Bradford, Callum was 3 weeks clean, not by choice but by circumstance. Bradford Royal had referred him to a drug treatment service, and his first appointment had come through faster than Ryan's, 8 days rather than 14, a regional difference in waiting lists that had no logic behind it. He was attending. He had not called Ryan. Ryan's community drug treatment appointment was in 6 days. He picked up the phone. He opened his contacts. He scrolled to Callum. He looked at the name for a long time. Then he put the phone back down. The kitchen light was off. It was 11 a.m. There was no reason for it to be on. He sat at the table in the daylight and waited for 6 days to arrive.